Good morning, Connecting Point. So today we're going to discuss Samuel chapter 17. This is the story of David and Goliath. This may be the best known story in the Bible, or at the very least the best known in the Old Testament. So popular that it has become an idiom used for any underdog story, and people likely use it without even knowing where it comes from. Now, I was attracted to this story because of the imagery that points to Jesus. And having the opportunity to speak has uncovered so much more imagery and depth, and I can hardly wait to share that with you. So my plan today is to discuss the physical realm of the story, what you would and I would have seen if we had been standing on the sidelines when this happened. And yes, we would have been standing on the sidelines for 40 days, just like the rest of Israel's army. Next week, I want to take a step back and see the greater truth regarding Jesus, the Messiah, and the kingdom of God. Now, to give us context for today, I want to go back to the beginning where Israel was asking for a king to rule over them. Their basic demand was to have a king just like the other nations. They wanted military influence, or they wanted political influence, and they wanted military might. Now God, whether in his grace or in his wrath, chose to give them a king. This king came with a severe warning. This king would take from the people. He would take their children for war. The citizens would be forced to be his servants, and he would take the people's food to feed the servants. He would take so that he and his cronies could live in luxury. He would take their working animals. This is significant because these animals are the tools of the trade and would hamper the citizens' ability to provide for themselves. In this warning, of course, we have the template for every government ever since that time. So over the next few chapters in Samuel, we were shown the actions of Saul. His first action was to fight the Ammonites, and that is a success. He involves Samuel and musters up the people to fight. And when they win, his place as king is accepted and secured by the nation. His life takes a downward trajectory after that. He never regains his good standing. In fact, his actions cost him his royal bloodline and causes God to reject him as king. Once Saul's character was fully revealed, we are now being introduced to David. Last week, we looked at 2 stories from chapter 16, and we'll look at a third one today. And these lay a foundation for the kingdom of David and show us what God desires for government. Chapters 16 and 17 seem odd in its chronology. Saul appears to know David very well in chapter 16, but has no idea who he is in chapter 17. So we can solve this by realizing that the authors of Samuel are primarily concerned with theological truth. We are indeed reading a book of history, but do not apply our worldview of what a history book should be. This is not about a chronological cause and effect list of events. It is theology learned from the examples of history. This far into our introduction into David, we can say that Saul has been rejected and David is the real king. He has not yet been enthroned as king. There are many events that God has in mind before that ascension happens. David is living in an already but not yet situation. So let's see what we can learn about this new kid on the block. Today, I'm just going to simply read and comment as we go along. I have many points I want to draw out. Some we will discuss this week, and the rest we'll discuss next week. This passage is long, so we'll get started. So join me in chapter 17. The Philistines gathered their forces for war at Succah in Judah, encamped between Succah and Azekah in Ephes Damim. Saul and the men of Israel gathered and camped in the valley of Elah. When they lined up in battle formation to face the Philistines were standing on another hill with a ravine between them. Then a champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. He was 9 feet, 9 inches tall, and wore a bronze helmet and bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. There was bronze armor on his shins and a bronze sword slung between his shoulders. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. And in this corner, wearing the red shorts, we have Goliath. Now, any reading I have ever seen has measured Goliath at 6 cubits and a span, which would indeed be 9 foot 9 inches. I did find out that some Greeks and Josephus, along with a few of the Dead Sea Scrolls, read that he was 4 cubits and a span. This would have put him at 6 foot 9 inches. Now, I'm not here to diminish what the Bible says, but we can look at it either way. Of course, 9 foot 9 would be impressive in any context. Although anyone who is near that height today usually suffers from a physical problem where their body never stops growing. They suffer with a lot of pain and are physically very awkward and slow. They have difficulty seeing and usually die at a young age since their heart cannot support this size of frame. This hardly describes a champion fighter. On the other hand, we have the earliest known manuscripts saying that he was 6 foot 9 inches. This could still be a remarkable size. When Tracy and I first traveled to Guatemala, we went shopping on market day. It seemed like the whole town was out shopping for food and clothes. Tracy always feels some comfort in crowds because she can always look and see me and know that I'm close by. I am head and shoulders taller than everyone else. This day at the market was remarkable for myself because the Guatemalan Mayans are the smallest people group I have ever seen. They are very malnourished, and as a result they are very small in stature. In this crowd I could easily find Tracy because she was head and shoulders taller than everyone else, the locals there. I feel as though this may be true among the ancient Israelites. If they had a similar short stature, they would also be quite intimidated by someone who's 6 foot 9. So let's go back to our text. He stood and shouted to the Israelite battle formations. "Why do you come out to line up in battle formation?" He asked them. "Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come down against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other." When Saul and all of Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified. So I understand that this type of challenge was quite common in this time period. A one-on-one fight to the death, and the loser's army would be the slaves of the winner's army. As we'll see in this story, these fights never ended that way. The armies would still battle it out, even though there was a clear winner in the one-on-one cage match. We also see that Saul has no courage, and his army, he and his army, are scared. Now, if a king who was chosen because he was head and shoulders taller than everyone else won't fight, what chance do they have? If this king, who was chosen to organize the nation and fight their battles, refused to do so, why was he even there? I also want to point out that Goliath is calling them servants of Saul. As long as they subject themselves to the kingdom of Saul, they would be intimidated. It was always God's intention to defend Israel and to fight for them. The people chose a human king. They rejected God's offer to fight and insisted that Saul fight for them. Yet the kingdom of Saul has no answer to this formidable foe. Back to our text. Now David was the son of the Ephrathite from Bethlehem of Judah, named Jesse. Jesse had 8 sons, and during Saul's reign was already an old man. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war, and their names were Eliab, the firstborn, Abinadab the next, and Shammah the third. And David was the youngest. The 3 oldest sons had followed Saul, but David kept going back and forth from Saul to tend to his father's flock in Bethlehem. So here the oldest three sons of Jesse are named, and this is the second time. The first time we met them in chapter 16 when David was anointed. Now I had passed them by several times while preparing for this message because his brothers play such a small, insignificant role. Turns out they tell us a lot more than I thought. Eliab, David's oldest brother, means God is my father. Abinadab means my father is noble, and Shema comes from the root word that means to be appalled. This gives us insight to where God fits into all of this. Even though this chapter involves men and armies, there is still the underlying narrative that God is moving the pieces. He is Israel's father. He is noble, and he is appalled at the current situation. God is offended that the hulking enemy is taunting Israel. God is appalled that Israel is facing a lifetime of slavery. Israel is paralyzed with fear and they have no answer to this threat. And in that moment, God sends his hero, the red-headed boy from the pasture. The chosen one arrives right when he is needed. Okay, back to our text. Every morning and evening for 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. One day, Jesse had told his son David, "Take this half bushel of roasted grain along with these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to the camp. Also take these 10 portions of cheese to the field commander. Check on the welfare of your brothers and bring confirmation from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines." So David got up early in the morning, left the flock with someone to keep it, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had instructed him. He arrived at the perimeter of the camp as the army was marching out to its battle formation, shouting their cry. Israel and the Philistines lined up in battle formation facing each other. David left his supplies in the care of the quartermaster and ran to the battle line. So David arrives with supplies for his brothers and perhaps a bribe for the field commander. I may be reading into the story, but I can't think of any other reason for Jesse to send a more luxurious gift of cheese to the commander compared to the bread for his own sons. When David arrives, he immediately leaves his stuff with the porter and runs to the front lines. Now let's compare this to Saul. When Samuel presented him to the nation, Saul is nowhere to be found. He is hiding amongst the baggage. When it's time for Saul to step up and take his role, he hides. When David arrives, he drops his stuff and runs to where the action is. And this is another reminder of Israel's rationale for having a king. They were looking for someone to fight their battles. Saul has a history of shirking his responsibilities when the pressure builds. David runs to the front lines. The contrast between the kingdom of Saul and the kingdom of David grows. Back to our text. When he arrived, he asked how his brothers were. When he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words, which David heard. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him, terrified. Previously, an Israelite man had declared, "Do you see this man who keeps coming out? He comes to defy Israel. The king will make the man who kills him very rich and will give him his daughter. The king will also make the household of that man's father exempt from paying taxes in Israel." David spoke to the men who were standing with him. "What will be done for the man who kills that Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The people told him about the offer, concluding, "That is what will be done for the man who kills him." David's oldest brother, Eliab, listened as he spoke to the men and became angry with him. "Why did you come down here?" he asked. "With who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your arrogance and your evil heart. You came down to see the battle." "What have I done now?" protested David. It was just a question. Then he turned from those beside him to others in front of him and asked about the offer. The people gave the same answer as before. Now I find this section interesting. Goliath comes out and does his usual rant. Everyone believes he was coming to defy Israel, but their conversation turns to the reward for the man who kills Goliath. To me, this is very curious. They are so scared that they refuse to act. They are facing slavery for the rest of their lives, but they're dreaming about the reward? I read this and I think, oh, maybe I've asked this too. Wouldn't all my problems be solved if I just won the lottery? Instead of fighting the battle, they dream of the prize. Yet this prize is not enough to overcome their fears. In the midst of this conversation, David asks, "What's that prize again?" And these are his first recorded words. I assume that he is told, and later he asks again. The prize is mentioned 3 times. Now, of course, this makes me sit up because repetition in the Bible increases the importance of what is being said. The prize consists of riches for the individual, a permanent tax holiday for his father's household, and Saul's daughter in marriage. And we'll talk about this reward a little more next week, since it ties in a little better then. Another thing I want to point out is that David's brothers were quite annoyed that he was there. They believe that he should stick with tending the sheep. They're saying, "Go away, David, the owls are talking here." Back to our text, what David said was overheard and reported to Saul, so he had David brought to him. David said to Saul, "Don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." But Saul replied, "You can't go fight this Philistine. You're just a youth, and he's been a warrior since he was young." David answered Saul, "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." Then David said, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." So David steps up to the plate and announces his intentions to fight. Saul was not able to accept this and came up with all kinds of reasons why David should not go. He knew that God had his back, and his trust was supported by past experience. David was able to fight off and kill a lion and a bear, and now he was going to go fight Goliath. He knew it was God who enabled him to do it as well. David remembered what God had done and continued to move as though God would do it again. Now, we have talked a few times about how we are to remember about what God has done. I've always personalized that statement and remembered that God has saved me, God has provided for me, God has blessed me beyond what I deserve. I have now come to the realization that this is much deeper. My personal experience and history are indeed my stories. The story of David and Goliath is also my story. The Reformation, the First and Second Awakenings are my story. The famous revivals are our history. The great and wonderful things that God has done in the past are as personal as our individual salvation stories. This history gave David the strength to go fight Goliath. If only I could realize that and live that. Now, is it possible that remembering does more than just refresh our memories? Is it possible that when we insert ourselves into the history of the church, our past becomes our current reality? Now, I'm not sure if I understand the thought properly, but try for a moment imagining that our history is the same as our present. What was true of God in the Old Testament is true for us in 2021. So that brings me to a table talk. Let's talk about that. Here are the questions. How does our personal history with God affect our present? How does the history of the people of God help us today? Do the stories of war and battle teach us how to fight in the spiritual realm? Okay, I hope that spurred some good conversation, so we'll get back to our text. Then Saul had his own military clothes put on David. He put a bronze helmet on David's head and had him put on armor. David strapped his sword on over the military clothes and tried to walk, but he was not used to them. "I cannot walk in these," David said to Saul. "I'm not used to them." So David took them off. So here we have another reminder of the hopelessness of the kingdom of Saul. His only advice to David is one of military might. He cannot see beyond the protection and strength that weapons and armor provide. Now, I have to ask at this point, why is Saul's armor available for David? Shouldn't Saul be wearing it, and shouldn't Saul be ready for the battle? Now, every time I read this, I remember the disciples. And how many times did Jesus have to explain it to them? His kingdom was not one of military might. He was not there to fight a physical battle. And 5 seconds later, they ask, when are the Romans going to be defeated? When Jesus is arrested, Peter pulls out his sword and attacks the high priest's helper. Now, after cleaning up Peter's mess by reattaching the servant's ear, Jesus reminds them again that his kingdom is not a flesh and blood battle. Yet we still cannot fathom a world without war. A time will come when Christ corrects us and will end war for us. The kingdom of Saul resolves conflict with war. The kingdom of David relies on God's deliverance. And then back to our chapter here. Instead, he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in the pouch, in his shepherd's bag. Then, with his sling in hand, he approached the Philistine. The Philistine came closer and closer to David, with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks?" Then he cursed David by his gods. "Come here," the Philistine called to David, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts." David said to the Philistine, "You will come against me with a dagger, spear, and sword, but I come against you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel's army. You have defiled him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll cut your head off and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it's not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us." Here we see another difference between David and everyone else. Back in verse 8, Goliath starts his taunts by shouting out, "Are you not servants of Saul?" In verse 25, the servants are talking with David. "Do you see this man who keeps coming out? He comes to defy Israel." Everyone is focused on the wrong place. The army feels that the insults of the enemy are against them. They can only see what the eyes see. David, on the other hand, knows that it is God who is in control. Goliath and his God are subjected to the will of Yahweh. David knows that the battle belongs to the Lord. My preferred translation that I've seen is "the Lord owns the battle." This tells us that this is not even our fight. We do not even have to fight the giant. God will do it for us. The kingdom of David lets God fight the battles. Returning to our text, when the Philistines started forward to attack him, David ran quickly to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag, took out a stone, slung it, and hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Even though David had no sword, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it out from its sheath, and used it to kill him. Then he cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they ran. The men of Israel and all Judah rallied, shouting their battle cry, and chased the Philistines to the entrance of the valley of Ekron. Philistine bodies were strewn along the Sharim road from Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from the pursuit of the Philistines, they plundered their camps. David took Goliath's head, brought it to Jerusalem, but he put Goliath's weapons in his own tent. Now consider how easy this exchange was. Goliath was ready to fight. He had 125 pounds of armor, a spear for close combat, a sword, and a helper to carry a shield for protection. David slung a stone, and the battle was over. He didn't even break a sweat. The text says that David killed Goliath with a stone, but in my mind, I think Goliath could have come back from that. Perhaps he looks dead, but is only unconscious. But to remove all doubt, David pulls out Goliath's sword and chops off his head and raises it up for everyone to see. He uses the weapon of the enemy to finalize the victory. There is no coming back to life once your head has been removed. It is a crushing blow. This is as final as it gets. Now, do you remember back to the beginning? The terms of the fight were, our fighter wins, you are our slave. Your fighter wins, we are your slaves. And as predicted, the Philistines are terrified and run away. Israel chases them down, and there are bodies all the way back to the Philistines' haunt. The Israelites then returned and plundered the camp of the Philistines. This is another important point that we almost miss. And I'll talk about it next week because it fits in there. So Israel plunders the camp of the Philistines. Let's finish the story now. So when Saul had seen David going out to confront the Philistine, he asked Abner, the commander of the army, Whose son is this, Abner? Whose son is this youth, Abner? My king, as surely as you live, I do not know, Abner replied. The king said, Find out whose son this young man is. When David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with the Philistine's head still in his hand. Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? The son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem, David answered. So Saul asked who David's father is. A very strange question when in chapter 16 Saul makes a name request for David to come play his harp. When Saul's servant suggests that one of the sons of Jesse is a great musician and a mighty warrior, Saul asks for David by name and knows that he's tending the sheep. So we are looking for spiritual truth, but not chronological accuracy here. I do want us to notice a few details out of today's story. We'll list a few today, and of course we'll expand on more next week. So chapters 16 and 17 begin to show us the difference between the kingdom of Saul and the kingdom of David. We see that David is God's anointed king. Saul has been rejected, yet remains king. David is the rightful king, but he has not yet been enthroned. The rest of the stories through 1 Samuel will alternate with a focus on Saul and then a focus on David. Each story about Saul will show us what not to do when leading, and contrast that with David's stories. They will suggest a better way to rule. So next week I'll go into more detail regarding the battle, the prize for the winner, and the consequences for the kingdom of Saul. Now I know this week's a little bit open-ended. That's why I think Nicole gave me 2 weeks to speak, because there was a lot to say. So next week, yes, I'll indeed talk about more of these things. I'll be focusing more on the symbols that can be found in this text, and these symbols can bring the story closer to our time and place. And if you have the chance, and you remember, read the chapter one more time. I'm not going to be reading the chapter again because it was fairly long. So it will help hopefully refresh your brain if you read it one more time. So that brings us to our table talk. This will be the final questions for the day. So talk amongst yourselves. How does this story inspire you? What have you learned about God from this story? And pray for each other, and God bless you all.